Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today. When Maine became the nation's 23rd state 200 years ago, we held our elections in September, not in November. Due to our early voting, Maine became known as a bellwether state. This status as a predictor of politics inspired the slogan, "As Maine goes, so goes the nation." Without getting into politics, I believe this obsolete slogan poses a reflective and relevant question. What is our vision for the future? How are we leading? What role do we play in imagining a new tomorrow? It is no surprise or news that we are experiencing a global catalyst moment. With the convergence of a global pandemic, the economic implications of that pandemic, and confronting long-suffering racial inequities, we find ourselves at a bit of a standstill with no end in sight. As a state, we are experiencing record unemployment, racial disparities in COVID-19 cases, new challenges to our education systems. Our infrastructure is grossly underprepared and under-resourced. People are suffering. Businesses are suffering. It all feels pretty bleak. Concurrently, our state is celebrating its 200th year. And as we commemorate Maine's bicentennial, it is my hope that we create space for beginning to reimagine the future, because we have a unique opportunity on our hands. Oftentimes, in moments of chaos and disruption, we revert back to our comfort, to what was. We longingly look into our rearview mirrors, forgetting that rearview mirrors are for glancing, not staring. Our glasses are rose-colored, and we yearn for that sense of comfort in knowing. Very seldom do we, as people, see chaos and catalyst moments as the rare opportunities that they are, to do something different, to change course, to reimagine. But how do we do this? How do we see disruption, discomfort, and discord and walk toward it? How do we leverage this unique opportunity to ensure that the way life should be is true and accessible for all? How do we allow the past to inform our present and future, but not dictate it? I'm going to offer a few ways. We listen to old and new voices. We embrace diversity, and we cultivate an inclusive culture. And I believe this will help us radically imagine what the next 200 years can be. In many cultures, there are symbols and stories of people learning from the past to inform the future. One that is really important to me is the philosophy of Sankofa. The word Sankofa comes from the Akan people of Ghana. It is a term that literally means to go back and get it. One of the symbols for Sankofa depicts a mythical bird flying forward with its head turned back, reaching for an egg. The egg in its mouth represents the gems or knowledge of the past upon which wisdom is founded. It also signifies the generations to come that will benefit from that knowledge. Sankofa reminds us to take from the past what is good and bring it into the present in order to make positive progress through the use of knowledge. It also reminds us to go back and reclaim our past so we can move forward, so we can understand why and how we came to be who we are today, so that we won't make the same mistakes in the future. Simply put, our past is an important aspect of our future, and in order to make the best of our future, we must visit our past, but not stay there. In my opinion, the power of Sankofa is that it requires listening to old and new voices. We tend to think of old and new in the age construct. For this particular call to action, let's expand old and new to also mean voices that have been here and voices that are coming to contribute. We can also think about old and new voices as voices we're used to hearing from and voices we have not heard for one reason or another. In 2017, I delivered a TEDx Dirigo talk entitled "Listening is Radical." In this talk, I shared the power of a simple act that we undervalue, listening, and how powerful and radical it can be. I define radical listening as a practice of quieting our internal voices and judgments, thereby giving our full mental space to whomever we're listening to. And to reimagine our tomorrow, we must listen to old and new voices. And to listen to old and new voices, we must practice radical listening. Practicing radical listening calls us to practice patience and acceptance, to be patient with ourselves, to accept that being a perfect listener doesn't make you or someone else a better or worse person. Practicing radical listening calls us to examine and interrogate our biases and our privilege. Our society and history continue to demonstrate that while it is our hope that people are created equally, they are not always treated equally, which results in a myriad of experiences. This means there's much to learn from people. We need only listen radically. And everyone has bias in some form of privilege. And we are able to be better listeners when we are aware of how our individual biases and privileges inform our perceptions. Practicing radical listening calls us to be mindful. Our culture is one of individualism. Just look at how we've managed a global pandemic. This unfortunate trait prohibits us from being considerate, thoughtful, and aware of ourselves and others. Mindfulness is about being aware of our feelings and thoughts. It's about being consciously and intentionally present. And radical listening doesn't require being a mindfulness expert at all, but just trying to notice that when emotions and attitudes are changing and to do something about it. Practicing radical listening calls us to take good care. Listening to old and new voices is one way that we demonstrate collective care for ourselves, for others, for the now and the tomorrow. Practicing radical listening calls us to disagree respectfully. Respectful disagreement releases us all from the goal of someone joining our side. And when we disagree respectfully, that means that I speak from my personal perspective. So let's all try to speak from our personal perspective, using the I more and the we less. And let's encourage others to do the same. And lastly, practicing radical listening calls us to act with intention, to thoughtfully include old and new voices, to apply what is learned in the process, and ultimately to take action. In order to forge a new path, it is important that we don't leave people out. And we don't leave people out when we radically listen. And while we listen to old and new voices, it is equally important to ensure that we're listening to all old and new voices. As we reflect on Maine's bicentennial, let's ask ourselves some difficult questions. For example, over the last 200 years, whose voices have we ignored or prioritized, and what were the ramifications of those decisions? And there is much to say about history. History often recounts from the perspective of those in positions of power, and seldom from the perspective of those disenfranchised or oppressed. And unfortunately, we needn't look outside of our state for examples. It was only last year that the Maine State Legislature passed unanimously LD 944, an act to ban Native American mascots in all public schools. This effort was not without its challenges, as communities could not understand or internalize the impact of relegating cultures and traditions and histories to a mascot. And then there's Malaga Island. Malaga Island was a racially diverse community consisting of poor African American, mixed race, and white fishing families. This community existed right here in Maine until 1912, when the state forcibly evicted 47 residents, exhumed and relocated the buried dead, and demolished the community altogether. These moments, both new and old, are parts of our 200 years. They are examples of what I hope Maine reconciles in the next 200 years and never repeats. So how do we listen to and embrace diversity? And how are we held back when we don't? Well, we become comfortable being uncomfortable. Comfort feels so good and can hinder and hurt us. We can become so comfortable that we stop interrogating our own truths. We frequent spaces and people, experiences and ideas, and live in neighborhoods that confirm or enhance our sense of comfort. Embracing diversity goes beyond neighborhoods and spaces and people. It is beyond quotas and checking boxes. Embracing diversity means that in the recesses of our minds, we actively examine and seek to override our biases. And we do this because we honor that everyone should have equitable access to opportunities, regardless of what makes them different. Whether that's race, gender, sexual orientation, citizenship status, religion, socioeconomic status, and the list can go on and on. We also embrace diversity because it enables us to be curious and innovative. We can expand our thinking and operate with a growth mindset. When we embrace diversity, we recognize that we are equipped with more tools to solve more new problems to achieve more better outcomes. You know, as a state, we are staring down the inevitable. Maine is burying more citizens than it is birthing. We are imprudent to turn down anyone who is willing to make this place home and contribute to it as such. We simply do not have the luxury or the privilege of being picky nor prejudiced. Our culture, workforce, businesses, education systems, infrastructure, innovation, industries, and our economy depend on us embracing diversity. And as we listen to old and new voices and embrace diversity, we must create an intentionally inclusive culture. When we talk about culture and hiring practices, we often look for folks who fit a prescribed persona of a role. I'd like to challenge that. Instead of looking for someone to fit a culture, why not invite people to add to it? Which leads me to the phrase, from away. How inclusive is that phrase? This subjective measure of who is a Mainer and who is not does not promote inclusion or belonging. It is antithetical to the welcome home sign that greets drivers coming up 95 North. In looking to the next 200 years, let's ask ourselves what makes someone a Mainer and whether it matters if their families never left the state or just arrived. Can we accept that being a Mainer isn't homogenous, but that it is diverse and multicultural, multilingual, and multiracial? When we think of a Mainer, let's think about innovation and ingenuity and connection to community and being a good neighbor. Because inclusion matters. A lot of research has been conducted on the topic of inclusion. For example, employees are more likely to leave a company or organization if they do not feel a sense of belonging. Employees are less productive, less innovative, and less engaged when they perceive the culture to be exclusive. And when there is a perception of inequity and access to growth opportunities and mobilities, people are more likely to leave. And let's extrapolate the employee experience to the resident experience and ask ourselves, how can we begin cultivating an inclusive, equitable, and accessible culture? We cultivate an inclusive culture when we acknowledge and value differences, when we listen and are curious, when we disrupt the status quo and step outside of our comfort zones, when we enhance and expand our thinking, and when we model humility and vulnerability. So as we look at the now and the future, we have a unique opportunity to radically reimagine, to ask ourselves what the last 200 years has taught us, to set intentions for how we learn and grow into the next 200, to think critically about the way life should be, for whom and for what purpose, and to ultimately cultivate a vibrant, diverse, inclusive, sustainable, innovative, and equitable Maine. And so will go the nation. Thank you so much.